you all. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. This is a 1-hour conversation. We'll end at 1 p.m. Eastern sharp. I have one favor to ask before we begin. It's not the usual favor. When you're not speaking, press the mute button. It's that too. It's the following. I do know that we're all zoomed out and it gets tiring and tedious. May I ask you the following for 5 seconds? And those of you who are brushing your teeth or shopping for milk at CVS, you're exempted. But just for a moment, could everybody turn your camera on so we can see you all? And then you can turn it off and you can multitask and brush your teeth and shop for milk at CVS. Chuck Lane, hi, and Bob Asahina, hi, and hi, Nicole, Sid Lipsit, and Ken Wallach, and gosh, what a great group. So, thank you. And now you are welcome to turn your camera off and multitask or continue as you wish. But thanks for indulging me. I appreciate that. So, it's my pleasure to welcome today, and we have 3 fabulous conversation partners. We have Marc Plattner, who has been a long-time editor of Journal of Democracy and is known to all of you as, I think, one of the most important students of democracy, curators, editors, and public intellectuals in this space. And thank you, Marc. We have Didi Kuo from Stanford University, who does great work as a political scientist in comparative politics, in corruption, in clientism. And Didi and I have had a number of conversations about the phenomenon of parties across the West broken or with loosening ties to voters. It's something that she studies carefully. We have Jan Surotchak, who's a member of the senior team at the International Republican Institute, has broad perspective, both as a operator, program manager, but as an intellectual and writer himself. He wrote for us recently for American Purpose with Patrick Quirk on how the United States in these times should think about assisting in its democracy and development work, political parties abroad. Marc is going to begin with questions and manage the conversation with Didi and with Jan. I'll take over whenever Marc likes to call on you, to invite you to ask questions. Feel free to put them in chat. And then last but not least, and certainly not least, let me embarrass Sidney Lipsit. All these things have to be created, and it's not by me, I can assure you. So this is the result of brainstorming and kind of co-creating with Sydney that we have this program today, and we have this fabulous cast of speakers and conversation partners. So Sid, thank you. And Marc, thank you. And over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, to you both for those introductory remarks, and also for arranging this panel on political parties in crisis. This crisis is not a new one, but it's certainly been highlighted by the events of recent weeks. Back in the spring of 2001, I wrote an article on parties for the old quarterly Public Interest, and that was just in the wake of the disputed Bush-Gore election. And I began by noting that all those involved in the election dispute claimed to be animated by the rule of law and the principles of justice, yet almost invariably they sided with those positions that favored the candidate of their own party. I expressed some comfort, though, in the fact that none of the street protests turned violent, that there were no injuries or deaths, and that the final decision by the Supreme Court was almost universally, if reluctantly, accepted by the losing side. In 2000, the Constitution triumphed over partisanship. I added, however, that in this 2001 article, that the favorable conditions that enabled this fortunate outcome could not be expected always to obtain in the United States, and much less in newer democracies. And our experience in 2020 certainly demonstrated the danger of unchecked partisanship. Parties occupy a curious role in liberal democracy. They're indispensable for its operation, and yet no one likes it, except perhaps politicians and political scientists, some political scientists. And as their very name indicates, they represent only part of the society, and so their motives are always suspect. Working for a civil society organization these days sounds much more high-minded than working for a political party. So initially, political parties were purely private associations, but as they became more and more dominant in the way democracy works, they increasingly came to be regulated by law. But still, like the media or civil society more broadly, they cannot do their proper work if they become part of government. They belong to a sphere that is non-governmental, that helps link civil society to politics. I could say more about this, but I'm not the principal speaker, and I want to turn now to Didi Kuo, Liz, and ask her first to talk about the work she's been doing. I know, Didi, that you recently guided a project that brought together a series of essays on the future of political parties, and that you're continuing your own research in this area. I wonder if you could describe that to us a little bit.
Hey, thank you, Mark. And Didi, before you answer, pardon my interruption, unless it's just me, there's a problem with the sound. And I've checked, and I think everybody is on with mute. Mark, could you mute, and could I ask Didi to speak and see if that's clear?
Hi, everyone. Let's see if does it sound any clearer?
Didi,
Okay.
you sound clear. And Mark, I have a sneaking suspicion it maybe is your microphone. So A, mute when not speaking, and B, if you're so kind, you might wish to try logging out and logging back in, but I'll leave that to you. And you've asked Didi a first question, and we'll let her dig in.
A quick tech point is if you have headphones, Mark, that might also help, headphones that have a microphone on them. But hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this conversation, and thank you to Marc. Well, thank you to the American Purpose team for organizing it. Thank you to Marc for moderating it, and thank you to Jan for joining it. I loved Jan's article in American Purpose, if you haven't read it already, about parties, especially in emerging democracies. So I, along with many other scholars of both American and comparative politics, have become increasingly interested in parties as organizations. There has been an excessive focus in the past few years on parties as sort of elite players in politics and how well they win elections, what their poll numbers are, what are their factions, which I think obscures the bigger crisis of parties that are tasked with doing the fundamental work of representing and mobilizing and aggregating interests in any representative democracy. So what I've been working on recently is a book about parties and democracy that I think tries to get at some of the bigger crises of democratic capitalism in particular. It argues that the erosion of trust in our institutions lies in a deeper problem of responsiveness and representation, and traces the history of parties from their evolution as mass organizations with a strong state and local presence, active party members, and deep associational networks. From the 1970s to today, the 2020s, they are now professionalized, nationalized organizations that are deeply embedded in Washington, D.C. with a massive electoral presence, i.e. their label is meaningful, but very little organization underneath that. The general thrust of the book is that parties have invested tremendous resources in winning elections, but in doing that, they have foregone many of their traditional functions or outsourced them to non-party groups and eroded faith in the party system more generally. And the reason that this is connected to democratic capitalism, which sounds kind of big and like it's caused by any number of other things, is that in 2017, there began a wave of global protests all the way until, I guess, the pandemic made it very dangerous to be outside in the streets with people. And we think of these protests as having any number of roots, but they were basically pro-democracy, but anti-democracy as practiced in their countries types of protests, like the yellow vests in France, protests against austerity measures or the lifting of subsidies in places like Iran and Chile, of course, the democracy protests in Hong Kong. And the broader backdrop of those global protests is a disaffection, not only in how democratic institutions work, but also in economic changes that have taken place globally. Since the 1990s, there's been more globalization, freer trade, and a neoliberal economic agenda that has set in place policies that are similar across different countries: welfare retrenchment, scaling back the size of the public sector. And a backlash to this is now evidenced in grievance politics, a politics of those left behind, and a sense that the leaders change, but the policies stay the same, which is a quote from Jan Werner Müller, who's a scholar of populism. So in other words, there's a general perception, not just in the West, but all around the world, that there are narrow interests in democracies that benefit consistently from democratic institutions, and then more diffuse interests who don't seem to benefit at all, can't seem to find adequate representation in their democratic systems. And they perceive that there's a political elite who doesn't seem to care, who is deeply aligned with the economic elites within their countries. So to take it just to the West, I have a feeling that this will overlap with a little bit of what Jan has noticed in other parts of the world. But the general thrust is that there have been three major changes to political parties, and in the United States, but also in countries of Western Europe, where democratic practices are long-standing. First is an organizational weakness that I referenced earlier. Even though parties are supposed to do a lot of mobilization and interest aggregation of different groups, they also need to cultivate a base that actively gets something out of being a party member. You used to get material rewards and incentives, maybe a patronage position, maybe you got a community of locally organized associations that you could then plug into. But that has eroded over time. So nowadays, as a party member, there's not really a formal party membership. You might vote in a party primary, but that's really the biggest link you have to a party. And that makes it very difficult to feel a sense of healthy partisanship. We know that in democracies that are trying to consolidate, partisanship is a good thing, not a bad thing, the way that we think about it in the United States today. Being a partisan makes you feel connected not only to your elected representatives, but also makes you feel deeply invested in the democratic system as a whole. But this is something that has declined over time, and it's evidenced by the fact that even though partisanship has been on the rise in the United States, more and more people identify as independents than they do as members of one of the two parties. A plurality of Americans now say they're not Democrats or Republicans. And party membership, like card-carrying party membership in Western Europe, has also been on the decline over the past 30 or 40 years. The second trend is programmatic convergence. What this means is typically in a party system, parties stand for really different policies. A policy is a way that you cultivate your base, is a way that you respond to the needs of voters. But especially since the 1990s, parties have converged on a set of economic policies in particular that I guess we would label under the broad rubric of neoliberalism. But typically, all parties support freer trade. In Europe, they have supported greater economic integration through the EU. They've supported, more privatization or deregulation, greater financialization, and any number of other trends that have worsened economic inequality over time. I think that when parties are able to reclaim programmatic distinctiveness, that makes it easier to set a policy agenda and to accommodate the needs and demands of your constituents through different kinds of policies. And in particular, the problem with programmatic convergence in the West has been that there's no longer a clear party that represents the working class. This is now the class that's sort of up for grabs between the far right and the far left, and can result in a lot of extremism in politics. And finally, the third change is a more entrepreneurial political environment. Because of communications technology and a diffuse campaign finance system, at least in the United States, it's become much easier for political entrepreneurs to organize outside of the party system. All you need is a name and a cause, a few donors, and you can, as the debate about Marjorie Taylor Greene is showing, you can call yourself a member of one of the parties without any kind of formal ties or sanctioning from the party. By sanctioning here, I mean permission. So there's a lack of faith in a party system that then drives voters to candidates who are anti-party themselves, like Donald Trump was in 2016, or worse yet, anti-system. And this matches a pattern of deinstitutionalization of parties that the comparative scholars Alan Hicken and Rachel Riedel have noted across emerging democracies, that there are greater incentives to organize outside of parties, that party labels are not associated with meaningful policy differences, and that you can't even really do programmatic promises effectively because of austerity measures that prevent the state from being a tool of policy. So I'll just conclude quickly by talking about American parties in particular. If you're following the news about American politics, you probably have the sense that our parties are deeply divided. Since 2016, the divisions within the parties have become clearer, as evidenced by the primary races. Among the Democratic Party, there has been a faction that cleaves between a centrist, sort of Clintonian centrist wing, and then a progressive wing. And then on the right, it's really difficult to be a scholar of American democracy over the past 4 years, but you have a centrist faction, and then I guess what we would increasingly call a white nationalist or an illiberal faction. I don't really know what to call it when it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a conspiracy theorist and a QAnoner. Like, that is, I'm sort of losing the thread here of what scholarship can do to actually try to think more coherently about those kinds of people. But underlying these factional politics are bigger questions of who the party represents and how it should go about representing them. And these are things that are being debated. What can party leadership actually do to sanction members whose behavior it dislikes? Does a party always have to privilege something that's going to be beneficial in the short run for their electoral goals, even though it's not beneficial in the long run for their sort of long-term commitments that they want to make to greater amounts of Americans? How much can you mess with the rules and procedures governing election administration without really tinkering with rule of law questions and the rules of the game that are basic fundamentals in a democracy? And meanwhile, against the backdrop of all of the factional politics within the parties, you're getting greater disdain for parties overall, just as Marc said. Americans have disliked parties from the very beginning. George Washington's farewell address warned about the dangers of parties. We already know the Federalist Papers very famously warned against the dangers of faction. So what we have today is growing anti-party sentiment, two major political parties who are sometimes facing their own identity crises and then sometimes just facing organizational crises writ large. And what I think could be an antidote to some of the unhealthy partisanship we have today are actually stronger organizational parties with deeper ties to the civic and associational infrastructure of the United States, with a greater state and local presence, to show once again that being a party member is something beneficial for you rather than not. But that will take any number of other changes to our political system, including rebuilding and recommitting to some basic principles of democracy. Happy to turn it over to Ron or Marc.
Yeah, I wasn't able to get a new connection. Is this intelligible? Yes? Okay.
Oh, Jeff.
All right. Well, thanks, Didi. That was a very nice capsule presentation of what you're doing. I think on almost every point, you're hitting the nail on the head, but let me raise a somewhat more general question about it, in that it seems to me it reflects a lot of other writing that is characterized by nostalgia for the parties we used to have, and in particular for social democratic parties. And I guess my question would be that if socioeconomic structures have changed, if means of communications have changed and so on, is there hope of returning to the old parties, membership parties and so on, or do we have to somehow think anew about what parties can do?
So that is a great question. And a difficult one, because I think you're right. There's a lot of nostalgia, as if there was this golden age of parties when everyone just walked down the street and went to their local party office and it was so great. we know that that's not really how politics worked in any democracy ever, not in the United States, and not even in, Sweden, where the Social Democratic Party was, or Germany, where they had these really robust, dense, community-based parties. That said, I think that the lesson, and this is work by scholars like Sherry Berman or Stephanie Mudge, the lesson is that class politics still matters. It doesn't just go away when the economy changes. So even though material interests today might be different from what they were in the immediate post-war period, there are still people who are losers of globalization, people whose economic interests and fortunes have declined over time. And they are people who feel disaffected from politics, and we ignore that at our peril. I don't know if that means you need a new party of the left, but I do think we have a lot of empirical evidence that you need a way to mobilize laborers who constitute the primary, set of people in any society or any market-based society. You need an effective way to channel their interests, that a politics that just accommodates like a professional and managerial and a class doesn't really work in the long run. And this is a problem since the 1990s in the United States and Western Europe. A lot of parties of the traditional left have now increasingly mobilized professional, urban, affluent workers, and therefore left this sort of void in the party system where the traditional left used to operate. But I agree with you, given the rise in communications technology and given the way people's lives are lived, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a sort of type of party that we had in the past that relied on boots on the ground, people going into their communities and having their party offices there. But I think that they can be mobilized online. Right now, the political party's way of interacting with technology has basically been to become databases of voter rolls and email addresses, where they can easily micro-target messages and raise money, which is really all they want to do, from people who they think will be sympathetic to their goals and to their policy agenda. But that is not really an intermediary function. That does not create ties of responsiveness over time. I think that you saw so much mobilization activity in the 2020 election, and you could use that to build up a more associational party. You could ask young voters to attend meetings like this, where you talk about what your interests are. You could get party leaders to actually have at least state offices where you try to take the temperature of what civic groups and associations are doing. And also I think that many of you probably saw the Our Common Purpose, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences put together a 2 or 3 year project called Our Common Purpose on how to rebuild America's civic infrastructure. And it noted that there's a ton of philanthropic and foundational activity at the community level that really tries to provide resources to activist groups and whatnot. And it's just a small jump from that kind of activity to creating ties with parties. You used to have really large labor unions that could do that kind of thing. That doesn't really, as we all know, unions have waned. But there's no reason to think that parties couldn't once again establish more robust ties with a lot of groups that already exist now. It's not a matter of creating new ones. It's just a matter of establishing new kinds of relationships.
And what would you say about people who would argue that it's not that the working class is being ignored, but that people are appealing to it on other bases, not perhaps ones that we might think highly of, but there is a contest for the working classes, but they just are not going for what social democracy has on offer these days.
I guess I don't think social democracy is offering anything these days. I don't think that there has really been an agenda that is not neoliberal for the past 40 years. So there is a lot of evidence that as the parties converged on economic policy, they used more values and cultural appeals in elections because they knew that they couldn't really offer distinct policies. I think that a lot of the hyper partisanship that we see that's based very much on identity or or culture or values is a product of the fact that the parties have very little else that they use to mobilize voters. And if you could I mean, I know that I sound like a real materialist right now, but I do think that if you could create more economic distinctiveness, that you would then not need to rely so heavily on the politics of culture, the politics of inclusion, and who belongs, who can benefit, et cetera. And there's, by empirical evidence, I mean a lot of good political science work showing that in countries where the party system is more distinct on economic policy, that they are actually less likely to mobilize on culture and value spaces, especially in multi-party systems. Mark, I think you're muted, sorry.
Forgive my confidence. And now I want to turn to Jan Surotchak, who is, as Dick indicated, has been for many years with the International Republican Institute, which is dedicated along with the National Democratic Institute to strengthening the political parties abroad. He's lots of on-the-ground experience. But I want to first begin by saying a little bit about the party strengthening work of IRI, but NDI as well. And the NDI's former president, now chairman of the NED, Ken Pollock, with us today. You may want to add a word.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Jeff, and American Purpose, and everybody else in organizing. And Didi, can I just say, like, thank you for taking us all to school, because I would sign on to 96% of what you said from an operator's perspective, right? And that's who I am, right? I've been doing the sort of like field program work for IRI for 25 years now, and in addition to that, sat on my borough council back in Pennsylvania, I think through 5 electoral terms, if I remember it, right? So, you know, this is a super combination of like theory and practice. So great group. Thank you, Jeff and team, for putting it together. Mark, you know, IRI and NDI, right? This all goes back, if I can just do a tiny bit of history, goes back to the early 1980s, and then President Reagan's, now I think in our circles, famous defining speech at Westminster, in which he laid out, in the middle of the Cold War, of course, the need for the then Western democracies to commit to a more aggressive and fulsome program of democracy assistance around the world, right? IRI and NDI have been sort of, you know, over time, have filled the role of the organizations that work directly with political parties. There are, of course, other members of the NED family that work on other parts of society, but you know, I think anybody, even today, in the fractured political systems that we live in, would still argue, and Didi, I'm very glad to hear you say it, you know, political parties still fulfill a unique role in democratic systems, right? We can elect a popular movement, an NGO, for example, to a parliament, and that's fine, but those organizations are typically not set up then to manage and deliver the votes that you need in a legislative system to be able to deliver reform and legislative change, right? So political parties really do, I think, fill a special space. And that's, of course, the focus, not uniquely, but substantively, of what IRI and NDI do around the world, along with our excellent partners, and this should never be lost, our excellent partners from the German political party foundations, you know, to a certain degree upon which IRI and NDI were based. And Didi, I want to go back to your NDI connection earlier, right? So in some sense, we're all here in the family. The German political party foundations, the Dutch political party foundations, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the UK, yeah, the Swedish political party foundations, right? This is a process that occurs not just in the United States, but occurs, you know, across Certainly the transatlantic space, North America and Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, right? Whether it's in Japan or in Taiwan or in other places, Australia even to a different and sort of lesser extent. So, you know, I would argue, if I can, Mark, for just a second, to be a little bit self-critical here. And, you know, you always want to be careful about engaging in self-criticism in Central Europe, because sometimes it doesn't end well, right? But I think, frankly, many of us were just desperately, hopelessly naive back in the post-1989 space, that somehow political party systems would evolve along the pattern that we all sort of had in our heads of the German party system. Big center-right party, big center-left party. The center-right party is largely based on affiliations with the Catholic Church historically. Big center-left parties largely based historically on affiliations with the trade union movements. A Green Party that, you know, sort of emerged in the 1970s and 1980s to handle those who were specifically committed to an ecological agenda. A Liberal Party, you know, fairly pro-business, pro-entrepreneur. And, you know, I think, and I'll confess to this, we believe this is the system that would obtain sort of across the world, right? End of history kind of a thing, if I can. And we were wrong. We were just hopelessly, desperately wrong. You know, if I take a look at a country, I won't talk about Germany because it's a little bit more complex, but if I just take Austria, I'm talking to you tonight from Bratislava, Slovakia, so I can, if I lean out my window, I can see Austria. In the first Austrian elections after World War II, after the occupation, the large center-right party and the large center-left party in Austria got well over 90% of the vote combined, right? Now they get well less than half. So just to reemphasize what Didi said, right? The institutions upon which our party structures have traditionally been built simply just are not there anymore, right? And I would argue, and I think Didi, you would agree, that the political parties that we work with now haven't readapted to the new situation, right? We're watching an adaptation, but I want to make one more point and then I'll stop. But that adaptation is different in the United States than it is, for example, in Europe, in traditional democratic Europe. In the United States, because of our party finance systems, because of the way that our secretaries of state operate in states around the country, for all sorts of reasons that we can go into in more detail, we have a two-party system. Yes, there have been third-party outliers historically in the United States, and it's not to say that they can't happen again, but essentially we have to resolve in the United States our fundamental ideological and political power tensions within one of the two parties, right? Europe is very different in that regard. For example, you know, in a system like that of Germany, when a dissatisfied, disaffected population on the right side of the spectrum no longer agrees, for example, with the policies of Angela Merkel and the middle, die Mitte, right? It goes out and starts a new party. In this case, for example, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, right? So it's a very difficult thing to compare these two systems. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle to remember. In the US, we are constantly forced to back again and again and again to these battles inside the two parties. And Didi, you addressed it, right? There's the progressive sort of attack on the systemic Democratic Party, the Clintonian space, just as Donald Trump represented, I think, you know, the insurgent approach to the Republican Party of the Bushes. That will ultimately get resolved, I would argue, in the party systems in the United States, but it does mean that the way we approach these things are different.
I wonder if you could also say a word about India and I. I think a lot of people are quite astonished when they learn how closely the two institutions work together by
Hey, Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm having Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm having a lot of trouble understanding you.
I don't know what to do. Is it any better?
Mark, it's not better. One thing take nothing from me. I'm not the tech guy, but you could log out and come back in, or you could log out and join by telephone, because in the Zoom invite, there's a telephone number. I don't have more advice than that, but whatever the crackling is, I think it's worse now than it was 15 minutes ago.
All right, I will try to leave and then return. Hope I will see you again.
Well, we'll see you momentarily. Thank you, Mark, for that. I don't know, but I think that the question may have been addressed to Ken Wallach. Is that possible to bring some of this stuff together? He says yes. Well, Ken, he says yes,
I say no. I had a comment and a question for Didi.
Please.
And it's along the lines of what Jan talked about. And I'm grateful that he raised these issues. I've always assumed in the American context that our two-party system reflected the political personality of the citizenry. That is relatively, from a political standpoint, a conservative polity. We had one revolution in this country, and that was about as much as the American people wanted. And I think one of the great weaknesses of the Gingrich effort was calling it a Republican revolution. I think people recoiled from that notion. And so you had roughly 40% of the American people identified as Republicans and 40% as Democrats, and presidents, tacked to the left if you were a Democrat and tacked to the right if you were a Republican during primaries, and both tried to come together to try to come to the middle in a general election to try to capture that 20% in the middle. And by and large, because of the system we created, the majoritarian system, that the two parties, particularly the Democratic parties, were coalitions. They weren't, in the traditional sense, parties. They were coalitions of various interests in the United States. And I get some of these fights. I co-chair the Commission on Presidential Debates, and there's always been this fight over putting a third candidate or a fourth candidate on the stage in the last 4 weeks of the political campaign. And my argument has always been, if you want to end the two-party system, the debates are not the vehicle to do so. You have to change a broader system.
Right.
And Jan's point is very important. Here, the change has to come from the two political parties themselves, because, if you're a libertarian or you're a green, you can start your own political party, but you're on the margins of American political life in this country. So the question, Didi, I have for you is, one way, and the question is about parliamentary systems in Europe and proportional systems. Is it better? Can this be addressed by the parties themselves, or does there has to be a structural change in our political system? And is a parliamentary system one way to answer these problems? Or in the European context or in other parliamentary systems, they're facing the same problems as we are. So this is not necessarily a structural problem to provide avenues for people who have alternative viewpoints to organize and establish new political entities, or is the problem much deeper? My view in the end is that parties are never going to, as Marc said in the beginning, are never going to be popular. They're never going to compete with the church, or they're never going to compete with the military or other elements in our societies. But the question is, how do you avoid a crisis of confidence in parties? And once there is a crisis of confidence, one of two things happen. People go to the street, or they vote for Hugo Chavez, who once famously said, "I'm not the cause, I'm the result." He was the result of failed political institutions in Venezuela, who were once the teachers of democracy in the hemisphere, with a strong center-left AD and a strong center-right COPE parties. So the question I have is this structural, or is alternative systems just as, I won't say corrupt, but just as weak as our system, and we have to address this in a different way? So sorry for being so long.
So Ken, I want to say thank you. And before you answer that, Didi, and I'm going to widen the conversation to include Jan too, but to put a point on part of what you said, Ken, in Germany, of course, political parties seem to be very troubled right now, and establishment parties, center-right and center-left, are showing signs of decay. And separate but related, and to you first, Didi, today's Republican Party, it was never easy to hold this party together, but were we in Germany, today's Republican Party would be or find a home in part in the CDU and in part in the Bavarian CSU, and in part those free marketeers in the Free Democratic Party, and in part those nationalist or national conservatives in the AFD, actually. So I present that or submit that for food for thought too.
I'll just add one point to this, and Jan talked about the origins of the NED and NDI and IRI, and it was really patterned after, as he said, the German Stiftungen and the role they played in the 1970s in Spain and Portugal. But one of the reasons that the Germans created these foundations was in response to the occupying powers that insisted that the Germans invest in the development internally of strong political parties because of the Weimar Republic and the weaknesses. But the irony is it was the Americans who insisted that the Germans spend what has become enormous resources on the development of parties internally, which then became external players in supporting their counterparts in other countries, and quite effectively in the 70s and 80s. So anyways, just a point.
So Ken, thank you. So let's hear from Didi and Jan, and then we have 15 minutes left. And I know Chuck and Kevin and Christian, I think, want in, and then we'll wrap up. But Didi, please.
So I thank you for that question. There's a lot to unpack in there. So the first is sort of the two-party system, why we have it in the United States. And you're right, it's a structural issue. I'm sure everyone here follows some of this, but there's a very basic political science theory called Duverger's law that says when you have first past the post majoritarian elections, actually we have plurality elections. So basically we have a winner-take-all system where the person who gets the most vote wins, even if they don't have a decisive majority. And this tends to produce in single member districts over time, two major parties. This is true in the UK. It was originally a Westminster system. So basically Commonwealth countries and the United States have this system. And it's a very consistent pattern that if you have proportional representation, where there's representation by parties that you vote for and multiple winners per district, you get multiple parties. So there are very few PR systems that only produce two parties. And there are basically very few, I would say almost none, systems of first past the post plurality elections that have more than two parties. So if you want to get multiple parties in the United States, you will need to reform the electoral system, the way that we translate votes into seats. And in many conversations I've had with the political reform community, this has been a very quickly evolving line of reasoning that we need some kind of structural change to the American electoral system. This is like a silly anecdote, but I remember when I first started at Stanford in 2013, I heard a scholar of the parliamentary system of historic Britain say what America really needs is a parliamentary system or some kind of proportional representation. And I thought that is the most academic thing I have ever heard. That's never going to happen. And yet we have the Fair Representation Act in Congress now. We have a lot of calls for ranked choice voting, at least 2 states that have adopted it recently, Maine, I think Alaska just did. We have a book by Lee Drutman, my friend, a fellow at the New America Foundation, called The Two-Party Doom Loop, in which he calls for multiple parties. The problem with creating PR in the House of Representatives is that we know from Latin America that the combination of PR and presidentialism is a very bad combination for democracy. And in the United States, given our Constitution, we are not likely to get an executive who's elected from the legislature, which is what you have in a lot of parliamentary systems, where the person who's the head of the party with the most votes becomes the head of state. In the United States, we are always going to have a separate president, which means even if we could get multiple parties in the House, we don't have a tradition of coalition government. We probably would get a lot of friction with the presidential system. So I feel very mixed about multiple parties. That said, you're also right that the environment around parties has changed over time. It used to be the case that two parties were thought to be a moderating effect on politics. PR systems were the ones that were supposed to have these extreme parties on the margins that were always sort of malefactors in politics. Whereas in two-party systems, you were supposed to get this nice convergence around the middle, just like you just said, Ken. And the way that that worked, even in a somewhat conservative polity, is that in the Democratic Party, you still could give things to your base. So the unions, for example, received a lot of patronage from the party. Patronage is obviously not something that anyone is really calling for a return to, but there were these traditional ties to the working class that we just don't have anymore. And I see a question from a lot of questions in the Q&A about the sort of relationship of economics and politics. Those causal arrows are sort of messy, but it does seem to be the case that there's interests have changed over time, that the middle classes who now constitute the base of the parties of the left are often have what are called post-materialist values. So ones that are not grounded in a traditional class or material need or demand, but instead demands for things like recognition or identity or things that are harder to sort of beat through policy. It's, you know, a lot of things that you do through maybe rhetoric. And that changes the tenor of politics, but it still creates the same void that Jan and I had noted on the left, that there are still many people who feel like there is nothing that represents them in the party system. So that is something about the United States that's hard. Are you going to get a return to at least one of the parties articulating the demands and the grievances of the left behind? Sometimes the right does that through appeals like the kinds Donald Trump made throughout his presidency. Sometimes the left does that through appeals of the type we see, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez making, that what we need is a very robust set of policies to address inequality, that kind of thing. But if you had a multi-party system, you would probably get parties on the left and the right that cropped up to do this. I just think that it's unlikely you'll get multi-partism in the United States, and it would come along with its own host of potential problems. Jan?
Thanks, Didi. No, I agree completely. I mean, I think for our lifetimes, at least, you know, we're going to have a two-party system in the U.S. There are just so many factors, some of which have been addressed here. They are what they are. I do think, though, in addition to that, right, there is this sense as we look at the, you know, semi-chaotic nature of the political party system in the United States right now, that the grass is greener, right? And if we were to look at a parliamentary system, a proportional representation system, that somehow it would be more effective. And, you know, I'm sitting here in Bratislava, right? And I'm here to tell you that it ain't so, right? Because, I mean, for a number of reasons, right? There's the whole, Ken, you alluded to Weimar earlier, right? There's that old story, right? And we all sort of want to believe that that was 100 years ago and doesn't obtain today. But the truth is that it does, right? As we look across parliamentary systems more and more, because political party systems are fracturing everywhere, right? It's not just in the United States that we have this challenge. You know, we have parliaments, for example, in Europe these days that have 9, 10 parties in them, right? We have a government here in Slovakia today that has 4 parties, but, you know, you could imagine a situation in which it takes 5 or 6 to be able to get to a majority in a parliament. And the challenge of managing a government comprised of that many different political philosophies and machine backgrounds is really fairly daunting. In addition to that, right, and Didi, you mentioned this earlier, we have this relatively new phenomenon of political entrepreneurs who have all the money they need, right, to be able to run a campaign, particularly in Europe where campaign finance laws are very restrictive. So it's a relatively low dollar or euro or crown or zloty investment to get into the game. And they simply make a decision when they're thinking about how to obtain political power that none of the parties are going to help them. And they can go out and create something for themselves. And, you know, with all due respect to my friends in France, you know, I don't think that's far off of what Emmanuel Macron did, right? He took a movement and turned it into an electoral vehicle that got him elected to the presidency. But is En Marche a party? I don't think so. It certainly hasn't been able to deliver in regional and municipal elections across France. And that's just one example. We see it replicated all over the place. And Didi, thank you for referencing the article that my colleague from IRI, Patrick, wrote that appeared in American Purpose earlier. I think it was in December. You know, we try to take a look at the balance between the ability of parties to institutionalize and the ability of parties to be responsive to specific electorates, right? And there are lots of parties around the transatlantic space and around the world now that are very, very, very highly institutionalized. They've got more structures than anybody could want. They own properties all across various countries, right? They've got hundreds, thousands of staff, but they get, you know, 10% of the vote in an election, and really can't deliver on all of that investment. And on the other hand, we get something like, I don't know, let me just pick up Babiš, the prime minister in the Czech Republic, who, you know, is a billionaire independently, created his own party, which is essentially not a party, but an electoral vehicle that got him to the prime minister's job, and will probably do the same thing again this fall. So people increasingly who want to have political power don't need party structures because they can create a vehicle that's good for an election, and, you know, they think that's sufficient. Different question when we want to address the importance of effective democratic governance, for example, in the middle of a pandemic, where those vehicles don't necessarily enable parties to actually deliver good governance to the people who elected them.
So Jan, thank you very much for that. Here's where we are. We're almost done. And so apologies to Chuck, Kevin, Christian, Luke. Read them in chat, by the way, but I can't give the floor to you right now. I will invite Marc. Now I have fear about the technology. I'm going to invite Marc to wrap us up with a final thought, if we can hear you clearly. Marc, are you there?
Yes, but can you hear me clearly?
Oh, yes. Praise
Yes.
the Lord.
All right, I did get back in. Anyway, I think this has been a very interesting discussion, and both in terms of looking at the U.S., but the international side of things as well. And just responding to the most recent comments that Jan made, you know, the problem is, let's say the old parties don't work anymore, but then how do you govern in a democracy? That seems to me to really be the crucial problem, and I don't know that anyone has come up with an answer to it. And what I might ask Jan and Didi as well is whether there are experiments anywhere that you see as what might be hopeful signs of a new kind of party.
So Marc, thank you. I'm going to give Jan and Didi in that order 1 minute, but really 60 seconds. Sorry.
Simple answer, Marc, yes. There are, I think, a number of traditional, what we would call mainstream, you know, sort of heritage or legacy parties around the space that we work in that have figured out ways to reinvent themselves for the new societies and the new information and communications environment that we live in. I don't have time because Jeff's going to cut me off at exactly 60 seconds to go into those now, but they do exist, right? They tend to be, from my experience, in smaller countries, which are, you know, frankly, a little bit more manageable and provide interesting sort of petri dishes for ways that we might be able to spread elsewhere for mainline parties, traditional parties to to adapt to the modern era. So yes, those things exist. In the end, bottom line, we need political parties, right? Without political parties, we can't run legislatures, and without legislatures, we cannot govern. So we have to find a way to make it work.
I'm heartened to
Thank
hear.
you, Didi.
I'm heartened to hear Jan say that there are successes. I know a little bit about Western, like in small Western European countries, parties that have been able to offer greater benefits to members. So they try to incentivize through recruitment of young people in particular, and giving them more of voting rights over candidates in particular. Because in PR systems, parties can control who the candidates are in a way that you can't in a system like ours. So they do things like primary elections, for example, as a way to incentivize membership. But overall, I think the story is a little more pessimistic in that we have so much historical and empirical evidence that when parties are weaker, that's really bad for democracy. It creates a lot of instability precisely because, as Marc noted at the top of the hour, there are no other organizations that can really fulfill the same functions that parties do. So I think that there are plenty of resources for parties to be able to do those functions well. Again, it's just a matter of sort of political will, which is something that is always tricky to discuss, but in a compelling way. But basically, if the leaders want to, they should be able to reconstitute some of the traditional functions of the party, but it will require some long-term vision of what the party is intended to do in a democracy, besides win elections.
So Didi, thank you. Jan, thank you very much. Marc, thank you. We ended up at a important place and a demanding place, which is how do we get this done? Democracy without political parties, and they are indeed in deep crisis for a variety of reasons. My suggestion to you all is let's pick spots and focus and go deeper in future conversations if you're game. I found this very useful. I'm grateful. So thanks everybody for making time. We're right on time. Have a good afternoon. And Jan, good evening in Slovakia. Thanks everybody. Thank you, Jan. Didi, thanks very much.
Stanford.
Marc,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.